The Salt Roads of Antiquity, white gold and human toil, the foundations of salt. Salt. To you it may seem mundane, a simple dusting across food, a pinch scattered on bread, or a forgotten shaker in the corner of the table. Yet, for most of human history, salt was far from ordinary. It was, in truth, one of the foundations of civilization itself, a substance so vital that entire economies rose and fell upon it. Armies marched because of it. Peasants labored endlessly to extract it. Kings and emperors levied taxes upon it. Wars broke out, quietly at times and violently at others, over this white mineral we now barely think about. To begin with, salt is not merely flavor. It is preservation. Before refrigeration, before sealed jars, before vacuum packs and freezers, salt was the one simple, reliable way to keep food from spoiling. Meat could be rubbed with it, fish soaked in brine, vegetables pickled in salty water. Without salt, the great harvests of autumn would rot before spring. Without salt, armies could not carry food for long campaigns. Without salt, cities far from coasts would never have tasted fish, nor could grain have been traded across thousands of miles without provisions surviving the journey. Salt was life. And because it was life, it became power. The first harvests of salt. Archaeologists tell us that the earliest organized salt production dates back thousands of years. In China, traces of salt works can be found from as far back as 6000 BCE. In Romania, near the Carpathians, ancient brine springs show evidence of systematic boiling to produce salt cakes. And in Egypt, salt was not only a preservative but also sacred, used in rituals and the embalming process that gave their dead eternal life. Already you can see, salt was not simply a substance, but a material woven into both survival and belief. Imagine the ancient worker crouched by a brine spring, filling clay vessels with salty water, setting them near fires fed with brushwood, waiting for the slow, tedious evaporation that left behind a crust. This was not glamorous labor. It was boring, exhausting, repetitive, day after day, season after season. But it was necessary, and it tied those workers to a network of demand stretching far beyond their own village. By the time organized states emerged, salt was already a cornerstone of trade. To live in Mesopotamia's great cities of Uruk or Babylon was to rely on shipments of salt from the marshes. To live inland was to depend on caravans of donkeys or camels carrying heavy sacks of the mineral across deserts. Those who controlled these paths, these salt roads, controlled wealth. The Roman taste for white gold. Few empires relied on salt as visibly as Rome. You may have heard the word salary derives from salt. Roman soldiers were, at one time, given an allowance to buy it. Whether literally paid in salt or not, the fact that wages and salt became linguistically bound shows how important it was. Roman diets, heavy with grains and dried meats, depended on it. Consider the Via Salaria, literally the Salt Road, one of the arteries of Rome itself. Along this road, salt was carted from the salt pans near the mouth of the Tiber into the capital. Without it, The swelling population of the city could not have survived. But Roman salt did not stop at Rome. Outposts across Europe, from the Rhine frontier to the far reaches of Britannia, required steady shipments. Garrisons needed preserved pork and fish. Grain fleets relied on brine stores to feed sailors. And where there were soldiers, there were taxes. Salt was one of the few resources the empire could tax everywhere, because everyone needed it, from the poorest farmer to the most powerful senator. You might imagine salt as a silent conqueror, spreading Roman influence as much as any legionary's sword. The bridges, aqueducts, and roads you know Rome for were paralleled by lines of supply that carried salt, often overlooked in histories, but central to the empire's survival. The salt of the desert, trans-Saharan routes. Let us shift our gaze south to the Sahara. Here, in one of the most arid landscapes on Earth, salt was paradoxically plentiful, but only in certain places. Great slabs of it could be cut directly from deposits, shining in the sun like pale stone. Towns like Tagaza in present-day Mali existed for one reason only: to supply salt. Workers there hacked out blocks, often under horrific conditions, and loaded them onto camel caravans. Picture the caravan, hundreds of camels, each bearing a block of salt as heavy as a man, trudging across dunes for weeks. They moved slowly, following ancient tracks guided by stars, winds, and the memory of elders. On the far side, in the wealthy cities of the Sahel like Timbuktu or Gao, salt was traded for gold. Quite literally, weight for weight. Salt, in a sense, was as valuable as the shining metal that dazzled Europe. Without salt, the food supplies of these cities would not last. Without it, the caravans would have no purpose. And again, ordinary people bore the toil. The camel drivers, the miners at Tagaza, whose lives were short and hard. The market sellers who parceled out small lumps to families. The Empire of Mali may be remembered for its kings and their gold, but salt was its quiet twin, the other pillar of its prosperity. Salt and faith. One cannot speak of salt without speaking of faith. In Judaism and Christianity alike, salt is covenantal. You are the salt of the earth, says the Gospel of Matthew, meaning preservation and worth. In Islamic lands, to eat another's salt was to seal loyalty. In Hindu ritual, salt is used as purification. Again and again, cultures far apart saw in salt more than utility. They saw symbolism. Think of the peasant sprinkling a pinch of salt to ward off evil. Think of the offerings at temples, of salt rubbed on newborn skin in some traditions, of its use in funerary rites. Salt meant permanence. Salt meant purity. Salt meant protection. And so, as empires taxed it, as caravans carried it, as peasants labored to extract it, salt also settled into human imagination. It was never merely flavor. It was sacred and binding. The gabelle and salt as burden. If salt bound societies together, it also burdened them. Few examples are as notorious as the gabelle, the salt tax in France. Instituted in the 14th century and lasting until the French Revolution, It forced peasants to buy a minimum amount of salt at high prices from the crown. You could not simply gather salt on your own. You could not avoid it. Salt was so essential that everyone had to pay, and therefore the crown had a reliable income stream. But this was hated. Smugglers carried illegal salt. Villagers rebelled. The gabelle became a symbol of oppression, one of the many grievances that fed the revolution. It is easy to overlook. When you imagine storming the Bastille, you do not think of salt. But for countless French peasants, the salt tax was the quiet daily reminder of their servitude. White grains in their stew bowls were tokens of state power, the long toil of salt workers. Now let us pause and imagine the workers themselves. Not emperors, not kings, not traders, but those who harvested salt. In China, in Yunnan, men dug brine wells, lowering buckets and hauling them up endlessly, then boiling the liquid over fires until only crystals remained. The air was choking, the heat suffocating, the labor monotonous. In Mediterranean salt pans, peasants scraped crystalline crust from shallow pools under the burning sun. Their feet blistered, their backs bent, their skins salted by the wind. In the mines of Poland, men hacked deep underground, carving tunnels that dripped with brine, carrying heavy sacks up slick stairways. What unites them is boredom and hardship. Salt labor was not glamorous. It was repetitive. It was tedious. It was often deadly. And yet, it was vital. Without them, kings and armies, markets and cities, faith and ritual, all would falter. Salt is quiet power. What you begin to see is that salt, though boring in its detail, was central in its influence. Roads, taxes, wars, labor, all bound by this simple mineral. It was everywhere and invisible, necessary and burdensome, sacred and profane. Even today, the traces of these salt roads linger. In names, Salzburg, Austria, literally salt fortress. In ruins, Roman salt pans visible near the Tiber mouth. In words, salary, salad, saline. Salt lingers in our tongues, in our language, in our landscapes. And perhaps that is the strangest thing of all, that the very mineral you barely notice once gave shape to empires. So here, as we conclude this first section of Story 20, you have seen how salt emerged as one of humanity's oldest industries, how it spread across cultures and faiths, and how it shaped empires in subtle but profound ways. Yet, much remains unresolved. If salt was so vital, how did societies ensure control of it? Who gained and who suffered from its power? How did entire political systems entangle themselves with the simple act of salting meat or boiling brine? Salt, power, and the politics of control almost equals 2,000 words. When last we paused, you had seen salt emerge from a simple preservative into a foundation of ancient and medieval life. It touched economies, faith, and survival itself. But beyond its utility, salt became one of the most controlled, contested, and manipulated resources in history. Kings and emperors knew well. To tax salt was to tax life itself. To own salt was to own the very rhythms of survival. This section follows the story into the political and administrative world, where salt was less about crystals in a jar and more about empires, taxes, and rebellion. Salt as political strategy. From the earliest city-states to modern monarchies, rulers recognized that salt had unique advantages as a source of revenue. Unlike land, which could be hidden, or grain, which might fail in a bad harvest, salt was consistent. Everyone needed it. Everyone consumed it daily. And unlike luxuries, it was not optional. This made it one of the most reliable bases for taxation. The rulers of Mesopotamia collected levies on salt transported by boat along their rivers. Pharaohs of Egypt controlled salt pans along the Nile and near the Red Sea. Rome, as we have seen, built entire roads for its distribution, ensuring they, not local suppliers, maintained oversight. To control salt was to control not merely an economic good, but a vital necessity. It was a quiet power, less dramatic than armies or gold, but often more enduring. The monopoly model. Across cultures, salt control often took the form of monopoly. Rather than allowing private trade, states declared salt the property of the crown, to be sold at fixed, inflated prices. The logic was clear. If no one else could legally sell it, the treasury had guaranteed income. China offers perhaps the clearest and longest-running example. As early as the Tang Dynasty, and even more so under the Song, salt monopolies became pillars of state finance. Salt-producing regions were licensed, distribution was strictly overseen, and penalties for smuggling were severe. The revenues were immense. Historians note that in some dynasties, up to half of imperial income came from salt, but the costs were human. Salt merchants and smugglers faced harsh punishment. Peasants unable to afford the taxed price resorted to clandestine wells and hidden pans. Whole underground networks formed, carrying illicit salt along back roads and across rivers. The irony was constant. Something as mundane as seasoning soup became an act of defiance. The French gabelle, a burden remembered. No discussion of salt politics is complete without France's infamous gabelle. Established in the 14th century and endured until the Revolution in 1789, it was not uniform. Different provinces paid different rates. Some regions were exempt, others heavily burdened. This unevenness bred resentment. A villager in one district might pay 5 times what his neighbor in another did, simply because of geography. The tax was not merely on purchase, but on obligation. Families were required to buy a minimum amount of salt annually from royal warehouses. Even if they needed less, they had to purchase more. This compulsory consumption turned daily necessity into daily grievance. Smuggling became endemic. Known as faux-sonneurs, false salt men, smugglers carried illegal salt in barrels, sacks, even concealed in clothing. Many were caught, flogged, or imprisoned. In some eras, the death penalty loomed for repeat offenders. Yet smuggling persisted because salt was too essential to abandon. When the French Revolution erupted, the gabelle stood as one of the most hated symbols of royal injustice. Its memory lingered so powerfully that after the fall of the monarchy, the tax was abolished almost immediately. To understand the storming of the Bastille, then, is also to understand the bitter taste of salt in peasants' mouths. Salt and the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, sprawling across 3 continents, also recognized the potential of salt. With coasts along the Mediterranean, Black Sea, and Red Sea, and access to inland deposits, it commanded abundant supply. Yet even so, the state intervened heavily, regulating salt mines and pans, granting monopolies to tax farmers, and ensuring revenue flowed into the treasury. For soldiers, salt was essential. For pilgrims traveling across deserts, salt caravans were lifelines. For markets from Istanbul to Damascus, salt determined whether fish or meat could reach urban tables. It was not dramatic, but it was constant. Ottoman documents show painstaking attention to salt revenues, reflecting how mundane necessity underpinned the grandeur of sultans. The Salt March and Colonial Defiance. Though this series focuses on antiquity and pre-modern history, one cannot pass over the 20th century without pausing on Gandhi's Salt March of 1930. Why salt? Because British colonial rule in India had imposed taxes on it, forbidding Indians from collecting or producing their own. The monopoly forced millions to pay inflated prices on what was literally drawn from their own seas. When Gandhi walked 240 miles to the Arabian coast and bent down to pick up a handful of salty mud, he was not performing spectacle, but symbol. It was an act of rebellion against centuries of state control over salt. Tens of thousands followed. The simple gesture of boiling seawater became political defiance. It was a reminder, too, that even in modernity, salt's politics had not vanished. Its control was still contested, its burdens still resented. Salt and social inequality. Throughout history, salt has revealed the stratification of societies. The wealthy could afford brined meats, salted fish, and generous seasoning. The poor often struggled even to acquire the minimum needed for preservation. Taxes and monopolies widened this gap. In France under the Gabelle, nobles and clergy were often exempt. In China, officials and their families received salt rations or special permits. In many empires, military garrisons had secure access, while peasants bore scarcity. Salt thus became another measure of inequality, one that cut across every table and every meal. The rebellions of salt. What happens when governments push too far? Rebellions. In China, salt riots were common. Smugglers, merchants, and peasants clashed with officials. Sometimes, salt-related unrest spilled into broader uprisings that threatened dynasties. In the 9th century, during the Tang dynasty's decline, salt smuggling fed wider revolts that weakened imperial control. In Europe, too, salt protests erupted. In Spain, in Russia, in colonial territories, forced salt taxes led to demonstrations. Because salt touched everyone, grievance over it was uniquely unifying. A king could tax wine or spices, and only the wealthy would care. But to tax salt was to anger every household. Salt as infrastructure. The control of salt was not only about taxation, but also about infrastructure. Roads, caravans, and storage facilities were built to transport and guard it. The Via Salaria in Rome is only one example. In China, the Grand Canal served as a crucial artery for salt shipments northward. In Africa, caravanserais dotted the desert routes, serving as resting points for salt and gold caravans. This infrastructure was not glamorous. Warehouses, way stations, toll posts, these are the dull bones of empire. Yet without them, salt control would falter. Again, the boring details held together vast systems. The science of preservation. Politics aside, salt's value also lay in the practical science of preservation. Empires depended on it for provisioning armies, fleets, and cities. The salted fish of the North Sea supplied markets as far as the Mediterranean. Salted cod from Newfoundland later fed Europe. In Rome, salted pork was a staple of legionary diets. This need shaped politics. States had to ensure stable salt supply, not only for tax, but for survival in war. Shortages meant weakened armies. Revolts meant disruption of supply. Control of salt thus tied directly into questions of power, conquest, and survival. The silent burden. And always, beneath the grand structures of monopoly and empire, lay the silent burden on ordinary people. Salt workers toiled in pans, mines, and wells. Caravanners marched across deserts. Housewives stretched taxed rations. Smugglers risked their lives. The story of salt politics is not only the story of kings and taxes, but of boredom, toil, and endurance at every level of society. So now you see how salt, far from being only a flavor, became a political instrument. It was taxed, monopolized, smuggled, and rebelled against. It built infrastructure and financed empires. It widened inequalities and sparked revolts. Its power lay precisely in its necessity, so simple, so universal, that it could never be ignored. But this leaves a question unresolved. If salt was so heavily controlled and taxed, what happened when those controls broke down? How did smuggling, rebellion, and shifting trade routes reshape the politics of entire empires? The slow decline of salt's empire. We have followed salt from its humble yet essential place in daily life to its exalted role as an object of taxation, monopoly, and rebellion. Kings and emperors built treasuries on it. Peasants and smugglers risked their lives for it. Now, in this final section, we turn to the quieter, slower story of decline. The centuries in which salt lost its primacy, not all at once, but piece by piece. What emerges is not the sudden collapse of an empire, but the gradual erosion of a monopoly, until one day salt was no longer white gold, but a kitchen staple, bought cheaply and thought of little. The fragility of monopolies. Salt monopolies were powerful but brittle. Their power rested not on the substance itself, but on the state's ability to control production and distribution. As long as smuggling could be suppressed, as long as armies could enforce tax, as long as alternatives were scarce, the system held. But history reveals again and again how porous such systems were. Smugglers thrived despite harsh punishments. Black markets spread across provinces. Local elites, meant to enforce salt monopolies, often participated in illegal trade themselves. In China, Tang officials lamented that salt flows in hidden channels like rivers underground, acknowledging that smugglers supplied entire regions beyond state reach. Even in France, with its notorious gabelle, authorities never truly controlled all trade. In some areas, as much as half of the salt consumed was smuggled. Monopolies looked imposing on paper, but in practice they bled from within. Revolts and reform. At times, opposition forced change. In Russia, the Salt Riot of 1648 erupted in Moscow when the government attempted to impose new salt taxes. The levy was so burdensome that ordinary people, already strained by other demands, rose in protest. The revolt turned violent, with attacks on officials and widespread destruction. The government eventually relented, abandoning the salt tax to restore stability. This pattern recurred elsewhere. Salt taxation, while profitable, was politically dangerous. It targeted everyone, and when discontent boiled over, rulers often found it wiser to retreat than to persist. Some adjusted policies, others lowered rates, and still others abandoned monopolies altogether. The quiet lesson was consistent. No state, however mighty, could squeeze salt without consequence. The rise of alternatives. The decline of salt's dominance came not only from politics, but from technology and trade. By the 18th and 19th centuries, preservation techniques were changing. Smoking, pickling, and fermentation had long existed, but industrial refrigeration transformed storage on a scale unimaginable in antiquity. Meat and fish no longer required salting for long voyages. Ice harvesting, and later artificial ice, provided fresh preservation without the same dependency on crystals drawn from mines or pans. This did not render salt useless. It still seasoned food, still cured certain goods, but it diminished its strategic stranglehold. Armies could be supplied with canned foods. Cities could receive ice shipments. Empires no longer rose and fell on salt roads. The end of the French gabelle. The French Revolution marked one of the clearest moments of salt's political decline. The gabelle, once among the most resented taxes, was abolished as part of the revolutionary restructuring. Citizens no longer faced compulsory purchases from royal warehouses. The salt trade, once carefully monitored, became freer. Its abolition symbolized a wider shift, the collapse of old monopolies, the erosion of feudal burdens, and the beginning of a world where salt was no longer chained to power in the same way. What had been a pillar of state revenue crumbled into ordinary commerce. Colonial and post-colonial struggles. Yet even as salt's role in Europe waned, its weight persisted in colonial contexts. As mentioned in Section 2, British India's salt tax became a lightning rod for protest. Gandhi's march was not merely about salt, but about dignity and autonomy. The refusal to let an empire dictate access to life's necessities. The march succeeded symbolically, inspiring mass civil disobedience, but the broader pattern was one of transition. By the mid-20th century, salt no longer held the global political power it once had. National governments dismantled monopolies. International trade made salt abundant. What had once demanded caravans and armies could now be transported cheaply by rail or ship. Salt workers and the memory of toil. If empires abandoned salt, the people who labored in its collection did not escape its hardships. Even into the 20th century, salt workers in Africa, India, and Asia endured grueling conditions. Pans shimmered in desert heat, mines cut deep into earth, and exposure to saline water caused lasting injuries. The work was monotonous, backbreaking, and often hereditary. Communities tied to salt production rarely reaped its profits. They bore the physical burden while rulers and merchants collected the wealth. When salt lost its value as white gold, many of these workers saw little improvement. Their toil continued, but without the same prominence in global markets. Salt in the age of abundance. Today, you can buy salt for pennies. Supermarkets line shelves with varieties: sea salt, rock salt, Himalayan pink, coarse, fine, iodized. Its abundance obscures its history. Yet that very abundance is a historical product, the outcome of centuries of control, rebellion, and technological change. Salt has not disappeared from human importance. It remains vital biologically, and culturally it carries weight in rituals, superstitions, and cuisines. Yet its political role has faded. Few modern governments rise or fall on salt taxation. Few armies march solely for its control. In some sense, salt has completed a full cycle, from essential survival to instrument of empire to quiet background necessity once more. Reflections on boring power. The story of salt reminds you of something subtle yet profound, that history is not only written in battles and monarchies, but in the dull, everyday substances that pass unnoticed in kitchens. Salt held power not because it was rare or beautiful, but because it was necessary. It stitched together empires through taxes, roads, and warehouses. It fed soldiers and bound households. The decline of salt's empire illustrates how fragile such dominance is. When necessity finds alternatives, refrigeration, freer trade, the mightiest monopolies dissolve. Salt's legacy lingers not in monuments, but in the idioms of language, worth one's salt, in scattered ruins of salt pans, and in the quiet realization that life's most boring necessities once shaped the world. So ends the long march of salt, from the deserts of Africa to the rivers of China, from the gabelle of France to the salt pans of India. Its history is not a tale of glamour, but of persistence, toil, and resistance. It is the story of how something dull and granular became the white gold of its age. As you reflect, perhaps the question is this: what other substances today, so ordinary and overlooked, might future historians call the salt of our time?